As the Formula One teams arrive at the Circuit de Catalunya, Barcelona, there's always a bit of buzz in the pit lane to look at which teams have bought big upgrade packages and which teams haven't. Normally, Barcelona is one of the first European races, but this season it's the third of 3 scheduled European races and actually the second to actually take place after that sad loss of the Grand Prix at Imola. And it seems that every team got the message and bought their big upgrade packages for Monaco or suspended them until after the Spanish Grand Prix, though Ferrari apparently didn't get the memo. And down in the pit lane there was a lot of consternation around the red cars. Our camera crew were down there filming some of the details on the SF23s, and we were thinking at this point we were a little bit confused because we'd been promised this large upgrade by Ferrari and the car of Charles Leclerc looked pretty much the same as what we've seen all season long. The FIA have got specific regulations for these show and tell sessions, and the rules for 2023 state that you must bring the car with the bulk of the upgrades onto the pit lane so we can all take a nice look at it and talk about it in sessions like this. Well, Ferrari realised their mistake after a little bit of a word was had by the FIA, I believe, and they brought out the correct car, that of Carlos Sainz. I think this wasn't anything underhand, it was just a genuine error, and I'm not surprised there was a lot of attention on the number 55 Ferrari because the upgrade package that Ferrari has brought to Barcelona is absolutely huge and could be really significant, though we've yet to really see what it can do. And of course, one of the things they were really trying to get a good look at are the rear view mirrors. Our cameraman was actually taking a look at those mirrors on the car of Charles Leclerc, and they're worth taking a look at because they're fairly conventional for the current era of Formula One, but Ferrari were one of the first teams to really start playing around with the potential of rear view mirrors from an aerodynamic point of view rather than just a looking behind your point of view. And you can see these aerodynamic elements above and below the main mirror housing here. Now, this is something the team basically picked up on from a technical paper published by the University of Miami some years ago. And the University of Miami had realised that having these little sections above and below the main mirror housing, which you can just see here, you've got these little slots coming in here and here, and those little slots basically allow air to pass around the mirror housing in a very controlled way. So the air comes in from the front of the car and goes into these little slots above and below, and then behind the mirror housing, guided by these elements above and below the housing, they come back together like that. Now essentially what it's been found that does is significantly reduce the aerodynamic drag, and a lot of teams have started experimenting with that approach since Ferrari first introduced it, though not every team is going with it. For example, Mercedes today has actually dropped that approach and gone to one without the aerodynamic features on it. However, once Carlos Sainz's car appeared outside of the garage, the correct car, we can see Ferrari have modified this component. Previously, you could see these aerodynamic sections extending the full length of the mirror housing, but Ferrari have opted on the new car to not extend them all of the way. And I wonder if this is beginning of a little trend, considering that Mercedes have dropped those elements altogether. Does it increase drag? Possibly, but such an important component will have a big aerodynamic effect downstream of that. And aerodynamic effect downstream, when you've got a major aerodynamic upgrade, that could be far more important than it first appears. It's not just drag reduction, it's all to do with other airflows that you can't see without a wind tunnel or CFD. We do know what the airflow does through those mirrors because of that very useful university technical paper. But the one thing I think a lot of people will have noted is that Ferrari have introduced a new rear wing for the Spanish Grand Prix. A lot of teams have. It's a bit of a different shape, but let's move on to slightly more interesting areas that are more significant on the upgrades. A new rear floor. Now there's some interesting details to pick out here that we've seen for the first time on Ferrari. We've got this little floor stay that's just been introduced, this little union between the main body of the floor and the section that comes out towards me. And this section is new, as is the little stay here. Now a lot of these teams introduce these stays. They do have some minor aerodynamic effect and it is a little bit of a sensitive area, but it's not a big change. Same story with the floor stays that were introduced in 2022 with all the porpoising stuff. The rear stay here is very much connected, but have a look here. It's got a little swan neck support and that little blister that comes up from the floor. Now, Ferrari are not just doing that for strength. Again, there's a little bit of aerodynamic gain to come from that. But more interestingly, look at the cutout on the floor that has been introduced here. Now, it is a single and continuous edge as the regulations require, because the shape goes in and comes back out. And those little cutouts in the floor, they have been found to be hugely powerful by pretty much every team up and down the pit lane. And I do wonder if this is all to do with just controlling the airflow inside the inner face of the rear wheel, because that's quite a sensitive area. That's what all the blown diffusers years ago were all about. But you can compare that rear floor section, which has been reshaped towards the end as well. It's a bit more flicked out. That section is completely redesigned, and you can compare that quite easily actually to Charles Leclerc's car, which it was very good of Ferrari to put on pit lane for us earlier on, so we could do a comparison. And you can see, look, no floor cut out along the back and a very squared off section on the old specification Ferrari. But look, a lot of attention on the old specification car is focused on this, the shape of the overall side pod of the car. This is something Ferrari has completely redesigned, and there's a huge amount of discussion about it at this race. And I think it's worth addressing one key point. A lot of people saying Ferrari have taken a look at Red Bull and simply copied them. And if you look at the car from this angle, yeah, you can sort of see there is a bit of aesthetic similarity between the Red Bull side pod shape and that of Carlos Sainz's Ferrari. And you can see that here where you've got this sort of ramped down section along the side of the car. But look, this isn't a mere Red Bull clone. I don't think you can call this a Red Bull. There's nothing of the sort, because the actual concept of the side pod is really quite different. When you start to look at a few more details of that side pod, you start to notice them. You can look here. So Ferrari have got their cooler layout, which they've had all season long, with those outlets just in a deep gully on the side of the side pod, something Red Bull doesn't have, of course, and then another set of cooling louvers a little bit further back. Again, those coolers clearly serving an important purpose. But I think the really important point to notice is this gully that sits on the inner edge of the car. This is something that harks all the way back to the 2022 season and the Ferrari F175. And I think that's important to note. But also look at this, there's a bit more of an undercut under the leading edge of the side pod. And yes, that is a bit Red Bullish, but it's not unique to Red Bull. Everybody's sort of going down that road. But let's look at the road that led us to this side pod design, because it's a bit more revealing. And I think if you follow me, you'll understand why I say this isn't a straight up Red Bull clone. Now, have a look at the 2022 Ferrari, the F175. This is the car that introduced these very distinctive sculpted sections and that deeply dished section. Coming into 2023, the SF23 had a very similar shape, that sort of soap dish section, the louvres in the inside, and a slightly less pronounced gully, but it was still very much there. Haas went on and copied this concept. And I think actually Aston Martin took inspiration from this and took it a stage further, but we'll take a look at that in a minute, because coming into the Spanish Grand Prix, this is what we'd seen all season long from Ferrari. This is the car of Charles Leclerc this morning, looking very conventional, and you can see that shape. But then take a look at it compared to the shape of Carlos Sainz's car, and then you start to see why everybody's crowding around to take a look at this car. There are so many differences here. You've got that slightly less deep gully that we saw on the SF23 at the start of the season, but look here, it's really abrupt, really sharp gully down here. You've got the cooling outlets, but look, the cooling outlet design has been completely reworked on the new version, the Barcelona version. Even back to the back end of the car, you can see the cooling outlet in the center of the car has been completely redesigned compared to here where you've got this car. And some people might say, oh, well, the car on the right, that's the Monaco specification. It's not, it's the Miami specification. So it's much of a muchness for these two cars. So it's a really big job of work that Ferrari have done to introduce these new components. And so when you take a look from the rear at the new specification of car, you start to realize actually from this angle, it looks nothing like the Red Bull whatsoever. It does though look a little bit familiar. And just note the asymmetric coolers there, by the way. It does look a little bit familiar, and the reason it does is this is following a big trend of 2023 F1 cars. And the view I found that was most similar between the Ferrari shape and anybody else was this, the Williams. Now, I don't think Ferrari have copied Williams, but they are very much following that same trend with a high side, a very deep gully, and a raised inner section. Obviously, with the Mercedes power unit in the back of the Williams, it's slightly more bulbous in the centre, whereas the Ferrari is a little bit sharper and a little bit narrower in the middle, as you can see here. And you've got that little ramp that some people are calling the Red Bull section. Well, it's not really the same, is it? Williams doesn't have so much of that. They come right down to the floor. And actually, the concept they're all sort of following, it was Ferrari F175 inspired, but it was, of course, the Aston Martin team that took it to the biggest extreme. And you can see that so clearly with this wonderful shot from above the car in the pits earlier today. Got a little aero rake on there, but you can see how deep the gully is and how it runs along. But that soap dish shape that we saw on the F175, very much in evidence on the Aston Martin. And you can see the ramps going down, and you can see that very distinctive shape. That's where Ferrari are going with their car. That's where Mercedes have started to go down the road of. And that's where Alpine at the last race really went along the same direction. So is the new Ferrari a Red Bull clone? Not really. Is it a Williams clone? Nor that either. I think Ferrari is something of its own design, but taking clear inspiration from a lot of other cars up and down the pit lane. Well, the question is, does it all work? In free practice one at Barcelona, Carlos Sainz ran the new specification car, Charles Leclerc the old specification car, and that allowed us to do a little bit of comparison. And overall, Charles Leclerc was actually quicker in the old car, but only by 1/10 of a second. However, the big difference was on the top speed of the car, something Ferrari's been missing out to Red Bull ever so slightly on. Carlos Sainz, his top speed down the main straight was 336 kph. Charles Leclerc down in 322 kph. So this new package is beginning to show some clear differences between the two specifications of Ferrari, but it may not be for a few races until Ferrari really unlock the potential of this new package, but it could be their first serious fight back step to Red Bull and even to Aston Martin.